Thanks, Nicole. When I first came to New Zealand, I was told that the North Island was actually a giant fish. You're probably familiar with the story. Polynesian demigod Maui went out fishing with his brothers. His brothers had a favourite fishing spot, but Maui wanted to go out much, much further. They paddled out beyond the breakers. They paddled out to the horizon. His brothers wanted them to stop so they could put down their fishing hooks and get the day's catch, but Maui insisted that they paddle on through the night. In the morning, they'd finally come to a spot that Maui was happy with. Maui had a magic fish hook made from his grandmother's jawbone. He cast the hook down into the deep ocean, and it snagged on something big. Maui pulled on the fishing line, but nothing came up. Maui chanted karakia and cast the karakia down the fishing line and pulled on the line again, and the fish began to move. Maui heaved on the fishing line. The fish struggled and thrashed to the point where the surface of the ocean churned and boiled. The fish was strong, but Maui was stronger. Eventually, he pulled the fish to the surface, and a new land was born. Maui's fish, Te Ika Maui, is what we now call the North Island of New Zealand. So, how much truth is there to this story? Geomythology looks at the overlap between myth and geology, and this story makes a geological claim. Maui's fishing trip was how this piece of land was formed. So is there anything to back up that claim? Geomythology, as I said, looks at the overlap between geology and mythology. And before we go too much further, I should point out that geomythology as a discipline is the sort of thing that academics might refer to as a bit iffy. The evidence is pretty thin. It's very difficult to prove anything, and people are quite keen to make fairly enthusiastic claims. So, one of the problems that geomythology also suffers from is that a lot of geologists don't know much about mythology, and a lot of mythologists don't know much about geology. I can let you know, I can reassure you that I know an equal amount about both, which is putting it politely. So just remember, this is not a scientific presentation. This is a bloke talking in the pub. So let's go and see where we end up. Geomyths come in a few different flavours. In one category, for example, we have stories where a tradition might be attached to a piece of land or a land form, but the story is primarily about something else. So take, for example, the Moraki boulders. So on the coast, just south of Oamaru, there are these boulders, these spherical rocks. Some of them are sitting in the sea, some of them are eroding out of the cliff, and they've been attracted to people as long as there have been people in the area. According to local legend, the Waka Araite Uru was sailing south down the Otago coast, bringing new varieties of kumara from Hawaii. And the Waka was beset by a terrible storm. It was dashed against the rocks and wrecked. And if you look out now past Shag Point, you can see a black line on the horizon, which is the hull of the Waka. The headland is the body of the captain, And the ship's stores, which according to who's telling the story, might be eel baskets or water gourds or the kumara from the boat, were washed ashore and petrified as the boulders. Now, according to geology, the boulders formed around 60 million years ago, and they formed in the mud deep below the seabed, and they've since been uplifted and are now eroding out. So nobody was there to see the boulders being formed. But that doesn't really matter because the myth is primarily about the shipwreck. The purpose of the story is connected to the land, but the primary purpose of the story is to memorialize those who were lost in the shipwreck and to remind the captains of future waka to avoid the reef and not crash into it and not repeat the accident. So the myth is attached to the landform, but the landform is not the primary reason for the existence of that myth. Now compare that or contrast that, for example, with Giawez. Now, spoiler alert, the English name for this place is Crater Lake, which sounds pretty geological to me. Crater Lake is in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and according to the Klamath people who have lived there for thousands of years, there used to be a huge mountain on this site. And living under the mountain was Lao, the chief of the below world. Now, Lao fell in love with, lust. He's the god of the underworld. He's not really a flowers and long walks sort of chap. Or maybe he was misunderstood. I don't know. But anyway, either way, Lohar was not going to take any chances. Lohar rejected Lao's advances, and Lao retreated in a fury. He went back to the base of the mountain, he darkened the sky, he shook the land, he rained down fire and rocks onto the village below. The people in the village were absolutely terrified. They didn't know what to do. 2 medicine men from the village decided that they would go up the mountain, and when they got to the top, they found a portal to the underworld, and they leapt in. On a nearby mountain, Mount Shasta, Skell, the chief of the above world, was so impressed by the sacrifice made by those 2 medicine men that he decided to intervene in the fight against Lao. He joined the fight, he threw back rocks, he pushed Lao back down under the mountain, and then he smashed down Mount Mazama deep into the ground so that there was nothing left but a smoking crater. And then he sent clouds of rain to fill the hole, and that's what we see today. Now, it doesn't take a rock scientist. It's the best joke in the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. It doesn't take a rock scientist to work out that the god of the underworld who lives under a mountain and rains down fire is probably a volcano. Now, the details in the story, the darkening sky, the shaking earth, the fire, the volcanic bombs flying down from the sky, that's enough detail that suggests that the original version of that story was probably an eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption. But what about the bit where the mountain completely disappears? Well, that part's true as well. When a volcano erupts, if it erupts enough material, and it could be, in the case of Mount Mazama, it was probably 100 cubic kilometers of material came out. It leaves a big empty magma chamber under the ground. And if that empty chamber can't support the weight of what's above it, then the whole thing will collapse back down into that empty void. And it's what happened at Santorini, it's what happened at Krakatoa, it's what happened at Taupo, which is why there's a bloody great big hole in the middle of the North Island. And it's what happened at Crater Lake, exactly as the story described. If we look under the ash layer that was left behind from the eruption, we can find organic fragments. And if we carbon date that organic material, we know that within plus or minus a couple of decades, we know that this eruption happened 7,600 years ago. And under that ash layer, archaeologists have also found the world's oldest shoes. So we know that there were people there at the time. It's also not far from the headquarters of Nike. So if you're into shoes, Oregon is the place for you. But what that means is, so this eruption occurred 7,600 years ago. We know that there were people there at the time, and we know that the details of the story are so good that it makes it extremely likely that the story of the battle between Lau and Skell is probably an eyewitness account of both the volcanic eruption and the caldera collapse. And that story has been repeated with great fidelity from elders to children to their children for 300 generations. So what does that tell us about Maui's fish? On a scale of, it's kind of about a piece of land, but it's really about something else, to this is an almost perfect description of what happened. Where is it on that scale? It sort of initially feels as if it's down here at the Meraki Boulders sort of end of the scale, doesn't it? Because obviously the North Island rifted away from Gondwana about 90 million years ago, and there was nobody here to see that, obviously. And even if there had been, it happens really, really slowly. Tectonic plates make glaciers look exciting. So where does this story about the shape of, sorry, spoiler alert, where does the story about the fish come from? Is it perhaps the shape of the North Island? Because as you can see, it does look a little bit like a stingray, and people have speculated this where it's come from. But that doesn't really ring true either, because the first time anyone ever saw that kind of top-down plan view of the land was when Captain Cook drew his first chart, and that was in 1770. And the chart already has written across it, E ahini o Maui. So we know that the story is older than the map. In fact, the story is older than human habitation of Aotearoa. It turns out that Maui was a very busy chap. Maui has spent the last 3,000 years fishing up dozens of islands all across the Pacific. And there's just a handful on here because the slide would look ridiculous if they were all on there. But there are dozens of islands across the Pacific fished up by Maui or Tangaroa. And there are many, many variants of the Maui fishing story as well. But they all have those basic elements in common. Maui casts down the fishing line, hauls up the fish, fights the fish, the ocean surface churns and boils, and eventually he raises the fish to the surface and a new land is born. Now, one thing that all of these places that Maui fished up have in common is volcanic eruptions at some point in the last 3,000 years, during the time of Polynesian exploration. And this story probably originated down in the Polynesian heartland around Tonga. And one of the things that Tonga has got plenty of is submarine volcanoes. When a submarine volcano erupts, the hot magma rushes up, hits the cold seawater and flashes it to steam. And the surface of the water boils and churns and looks as if it's teeming with fish. And if the eruption breaches the surface, things get even more exciting. Tell me that doesn't look like the fish of a tale. I told you some of the evidence was a bit thin. One of the other things that submarine volcanoes often do is create new land. As the volcano erupts, the volcanic cone can get higher and higher and higher until it gets to the point where it creates a new island. If it keeps erupting, the land can expand around it. And these are also areas that would have been well known to fishermen, because in the deep, deep ocean, the life tends to congregate in the shallow areas. And so submarine seamounts are teeming with life. So fishermen over the last 3,000 years, as people have explored this area, fishermen would have been very familiar with these areas. And they would have seen eruptions like that. They would have seen how the sea behaves. They would have seen the land be created. And even if they weren't there for the main event, you would go to your traditional fishing area and find there's an island there that wasn't there yesterday or last week. So, I mean, it's completely plausible that fishermen would make up a story in which the hero was a great fisherman and in which the fish was this big. But is this just a coincidence? Is this, I mean, it's maybe plausible. You might believe it, but is there any more to it than that? Australian geoscientist Patrick Nunn has taken a look at a whole swathe of Maui stories from across the Pacific and compared it to the local geography. And he's discovered a couple of interesting things. So there are lots of different variations of the Maui story. For example, in some versions of the Maui story, Maui's brothers chop up the fish because they want their share of the catch, and the fish struggles and writhes in agony as they're doing that. And in places that have the writhing fish after it's been brought to the surface, those stories tend to coincide with islands that also experience seismic uplift. So as well as the volcanic activity, there are earthquakes that tend to lift the land further. So the writhing fish motif happens on islands that also have earthquakes. There are variants of the story where Maui's fishing line breaks. And those tend to be parts of the Pacific where islands appear and then disappear. When a submarine volcano erupts, it can build up above the surface, but the rock tends to be loose and unconsolidated, and maybe it just collapses under its own weight. Maybe it's eroded by wave action, or maybe a second eruption removes all the material, and the land that was fished up disappears back below the waves. The eruption that you can see here is the eruption in 2015 in Tonga that created the island of Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'api. My apologies to lovers of the Tongan language. I probably have butchered that. And this is the island that appeared during that eruption, which grew over time. And then at the beginning of 2022, Maui's fishing line snapped and it's disappeared back into the sea. We can't prove that submarine volcanoes are responsible for the fishing up stories, but the connection of variants of the story matched up to geographic detail of all of the different islands where these stories come from is at least suggestive. 99% of human history happened before we wrote anything down. And all over the world, there are stories that contain eyewitness accounts of incredible events, and the details of those stories have been passed down for hundreds of generations. These are not stories that can be treated lightly like fairy stories, children's stories. We might not take them literally, but we should take them seriously.
A lot of these stories come from Indigenous communities and Indigenous storytelling. And in a way, what you're doing like validates Indigenous science that goes back for ages, which is great. Validating in a Western sense, I should say. How do you compare that with protecting their culture, their knowledge, and their taonga with these stories that they do share?
I think oral tradition is it's like a dense web of geography and history and genealogy and moral instruction and life hacks. There's all sorts of information embedded into these stories, and the geological history is one little strand of that. It's like the story about the Meraki boulders. There's one tiny aspect of that which is about its relationship to the land, and I think if you kind of go into the full detail of that story, it talks about the people who are involved and the history. So for me, coming in as an outsider, I can I've been to Meraki and I recognise the landforms around Otago, but I'm not from Ngāti Māmoe, so I don't recognise the names in the story, for example. But if I, to different people, all of those names will mean things. They're part of their genealogy, and so I think you've got to take these stories as the whole bundle and accept that they will mean different things to different people. And so and in this explanation, we've sort of taken out one strand of it and said there's real history in here. There's real human experience behind these stories, but it's certainly not the whole story.
Any other questions?
Surely there must be stories like this from the UK, not just the Pacific people. They must have, there's the giant steps, I think, in Ireland and places like that. So
the Giant's Causeway, yeah.
Yeah, Giant's Causeway. So it's not just a thing from the Pacific. It must be all worldwide.
Absolutely. So, yeah, there are geomythological stories. There are indigenous stories everywhere that there are people. And there are... I chose New Zealand examples or Pacific examples because that's where we are. But there are all sorts of stories in the UK. I mean, part of the difficulty with picking out stories from somewhere like England, Scotland, Ireland is that because history has been written down for so much longer, a lot of the oral stuff has been lost. But there are certainly stories around, like for example, around the Orkney Islands, around Scottish Islands. There's a lot of stuff that dates from, and this is true of Australia as well, there's a lot of stories that date from the end of the last ice age. There was as the glaciers melted, there was a huge rise in sea levels, and so there are lots and lots of stories from coastal areas about the inundation of the sea, and in a lot of places that happened really, really quickly, and so that's been recorded in oral tradition and passed down in the same way. Some of those stories could be 10 or 12,000 years old.
Thanks for that. Just extending that last question, we know that some geological events are truly epic in scale. And could have been observed by peoples many hundreds of kilometers apart. Mm-hmm. Have you come across anything to suggest that there are two different mythologies from two different peoples that are actually talking about the same event?
Not two different mythologies as such, I think, because part of the problem we have is it is quite difficult to match up a story that doesn't necessarily have fixed dates in it. Is very difficult to match up to an event that we have some other records for. But there's an example from again, there's a similar sort of region that Crater Lake is in the Cascades in the US, where there are stories that are about an earthquake and a tsunami. So and it talks about the shaking, talks about the water coming up to the beach and scraping everything away. And there are records from Japan who had written records at the time where they call it the orphan tsunami. because usually a tsunami there's an earthquake first and then the tsunami happens, and in this orphan tsunami, which is written down in Japan, there's a tsunami with no obvious cause. And it seems to be that there was a massive earthquake off the coast of the US, which caused a tsunami in Japan. So, and the earthquake and the tsunami are recorded in the oral traditions of the people who lived in America at the time, and they're recorded in the Japanese written record so that we know that it happened at 9 p.m. on the 26th of January 1700.
Have you looked into the myth of the Great Flood at all? Because I understand there's been some geological basis to a possibility of some event in history for that.
So a Noah's flood?
Yes.
Yeah. Noah's flood is interesting. Again, because Noah's flood has been recorded in writing for so long, and the record that we've got, what's now written in Genesis has been edited and re-edited several times. And I think one of the things that we often get with these stories is that when an event is described, we don't know whether it's a single event or whether it's a kind of an aggregate story about multiple events. And we see it with floods, with areas that flood frequently. You might have one flood story, but it's really about that combined experience of all of the floods that people in ancestral times have experienced. And we see the same thing with tsunami stories. You have a specific story that happened to some named people at a named place, but it may actually be multiple events that have been turned into one story. But no, I mean, Noah's flood is interesting because Noah's flood was kind of the motivation for a lot of the early exploration in geology. People went out looking for evidence of the flood, and there was a huge amount of work originally done, by very early geologists looking for evidence of the flood. But it's probably an amalgamation of multiple events.
Hi, huge fan of geomythology. But I had a question. Yeah. My question
There's
is.
two.
There's two. My question is, what can we do in the natural disaster, education zone, to help make learning about these events, geological events, which have a real impact on human health? What can we do to make them more compelling, or how can we use geomythologies to potentially help future-proof our understandings of natural disasters?
I genuinely don't know the answer to that question. As I said, I'm not an expert geologist and I'm not an expert mythologist, and I know even less about education. But I can imagine that the incorporation of these stories can be used to make lessons more compelling. And for example, NIWA does research work into stories of things like tsunamis. So there's been research done with Nite ChCh in the Marlborough Sounds, who have tsunami stories in their history, and it's really useful for somebody like NIWA for exactly that sort of reason, to know how often do tsunamis happen in this area, what direction do they come from. Is it something that's happened once, or is it something that's happened loads of times? So it's certainly, though these stories are getting incorporated into research. But in terms of education, I can imagine that it would help make these ideas compelling. But it's not really something I know much about at all.
Thank you so much.